Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Russia has always been dead against a U.S. NATO-led European defense system that could knock out enemy missiles. But with the conflict in Ukraine, Germany is now signing up other countries to join its program. For a nation that has been a persistent laggard in defense spending and a reluctant supplier of weapons to Ukraine, is this finally the time that Berlin burnishes its defensive credentials? Welcome to the program. Good to have your company. I'm David Foster. The assault on Ukraine has increased pressure on Germany to step up its contribution to the Western alliance, despite historic reservations following the Second World War. At least 15 countries have now signed up for Germany's long-term project to build a missile defense shield, which may employ technology from Israel, the United States, and Germany. But is Germany a reliable defense partner? And we go first to Brussels, where we see Edward Hunter Christie, former NATO official, now at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs, to Washington, D.C., and we welcome Elisabeth Braw, resident fellow foreign and defense policy at the American Enterprise Institute and in Portsmouth in the UK. Professor Peter Roberts, senior associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute, RUSI. Great to have you all on. Peter, let me ask you this first of all. Europe is a big continent. How do you defend all of it with one system?
Quite simply, you can't. I think the reality is that you need a multitude of systems that cover a range of threats, everything from hypersonic right down to drones. They require very different solutions. There's no one size fits all here, and it requires enormous investments. So everything from your ability to see things, to get that information to the person who could decide in the right time, to the interceptors that can actually reach out and hit whatever is coming towards you. Now, that's a really complex problem. I mean, it's hugely more complex than a lot of the cyber stuff that goes on. This is a multitude of orders greater than anything that we currently have. Now, NATO's been working on this problem for about 20 or 30 years. They've had the sort of command and control ideas behind them, netting that all together. But what we've lacked is the ability to protect it, because there's been no real political will to do so before. Until we've seen the missiles raining down in Ukraine from Russia, until we've heard about Putin's will to use missiles on the homeland, it has become a mantra in parliaments that wars happen over there and not here in the homeland. And so for once, the politicians seem to be putting their gear in order and trying to get themselves around this idea of how to protect the homeland, something that probably won't be possible for at least 10 years.
Yeah, let me come to you, but if I may. You represent Finland. You were on NATO. You can tell me what happened at NATO with regard to this over the years. But I want to ask you specifically about your own country first, because every country has different needs. What are the real concerns in Finland about any delays there might be in getting a system such as this?
Well, Finland overall is relatively well defended. It's probably one of the countries, or maybe even the Western European country, that is stuck to a traditional defense concept more than any other. And so you still have conscription. You have a relatively large force size in spite of a small population. And this is, of course, very strongly motivated by Finland's history and geography. So by and large, Finland is relatively well prepared, both on the military side and on the civilian side.
Elisabeth, this is from Christine Lambrecht, Germany's defense minister. We need to fill these gaps quickly. We are living in threatening, dangerous times, but it's going to take years to fill those gaps, isn't it? It can't be done quickly.
That's right, and I must say it's fine for Christine Lambrecht to make this case, but she hasn't exactly been interested in defense over the years, nor has really anybody else in the Social Democratic Party of Germany, nor really in the Christian Democratic Party. They've had a string of defense ministers who saw the defense minister post as a step towards greater glory, and in the case of her one of her recent predecessor, Ursula von der Leyen, she has gone on to greater glory as president of the European Commission. So if you treat the defense minister post that way, which has been the case with almost everybody except AKK, who was Lambrecht's immediate predecessor, then you will get preparedness and capabilities that correspond to your lacking interest. And that is really Germany's problem, not lack of money or lack of insight regarding the threat. It's really the lacking interest of each, almost every single one of their defense ministers. And now it's becoming an urgent problem, which is why Christine Lambrecht is suddenly recognizing that something needs to be done. Unfortunately, it's not going to be able to be done soon enough.
But Elisabeth, if this takes years, and the conflict may well be over within just a few months, maybe a few years, if it's going to take years, what is this proving? Because it won't actually be defending Europe against Russia at that point.
This is really the dilemma of all defense planners, is it not? That you have to announce at some point that you're going to invest in something, but you don't know whether the threat you're actually investing in defending your country against will be there at that point. But you also can't say, well, I suppose since I won't know whether it's there in 10 years or 5 years or whatever the time frame may be, I won't invest at all. And so there is always this time lag, and it's no different this time, but it's better, I think, from a political point of view, from a Stratcom point of view, to at least want to do something. And let's hope Russia is very friendly 10 years from now, 5 years from now, 2 years from now, and that we won't need any of this. But in the meantime, it's clearly wise to communicate to the Russians that Germany and indeed these other countries, including Finland, will have these capabilities a few years from now.
Peter, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I think there's three elements here. One is it's what's left of the Russian military, and does Putin still survive after Ukraine? We know that Russia will build back. Powers tend to build back their militaries better. They reform. They don't make the same mistakes. But whatever happens, Russia has retained a really significant stock of hypersonic missiles and other airborne weapons that range everything from small drones right the way through to intercontinental ballistic missiles. In some way, you're going to have to protect yourselves against that. And in many ways, this realization is that Putin is not scared of hitting homelands. And therefore, protection must be made for cities, for countries, for entire regions if necessary. And that investment is going to take some time. Now, that links to the second point, because European industry is not geared to provide this kind of protection, this number of systems that is going to be required. There is just no way that even if with all the money in the world, you can't make European factories that will turn out enough missiles within 10 years to protect the European continent. Even 5, 6 big cities are not going to be protected within that time frame. And that's worrying, because the third part of this is not just Russia, it's about emerging threats. And whilst we're focused on this because Russia has been using long-range weapons to target cities, it's also the case around the world where we're seeing a democratization of these weapons. We're seeing the Houthis, who've moved from an insurgent movement in Yemen, which 5 years, at one point it was making improvised explosive devices out of manure in mud huts. 5 years later is firing very sophisticated ballistic missiles and cruise missiles over ranges of thousands of kilometers into Saudi Arabia at its critical national infrastructure and against United Arab Emirates.
Okay, so threats are always changing, and you have to keep up with that. Edward, let me come to you after we hear from Lloyd Austin, who's the US Defense Secretary.
Some of these systems could take weeks or months. Other systems may take years. For example, you heard us mention a couple of days ago that we're going to provide Ukraine with 18 additional HIMARS. We purchase those HIMARS, but it'll be a couple of years before they're actually produced and introduced. In the meantime, we've provided 4 HIMARS systems that will be introduced immediately, and that'll give them additional capability to the capabilities that they have right now. And by the way, they've been using that capability very, very effectively.
So there he is talking about a particular missile defense system, HIMARS. How adequately do you think NATO believes its member countries are protected at the moment? And what do you make of HIMARS, if you want to comment on that?
Well, first of all, I mean, the HIMARS is a battlefield system. It's a multiple launch rocket system. it's not for defense. It's for essentially Ukraine has been taking out targets behind the Russian lines inside Ukraine, hitting fuel depots, hitting bases, hitting various targets. So it's really a war-fighting system. And many military analysts would agree that it's been pivotal in how Ukraine has been able to turn the tide in Ukraine. So it's good news for the Ukrainians that they're going to get an additional batch, but as we can see, it has to be manufactured and it will take some time. But the HIMARS system has proven to be incredibly effective.
If you want to take a look, and we'll bring up a picture of it now, at Israel's Iron Dome defense system, which is basically fairly localized as opposed to covering a whole continent, which they're suggesting with this one. Would you be able to say that this is the sort of way that it would work? The radar would detect something that was coming in, it would then send up its own missile, rocket, artillery shell, or whatever to take it out. Is that the sort of thing that they have in mind with this new plan?
Well, I mean, that's generally how air defense systems work. You have to have an array of different types of radars, and you have different types of interceptor systems that function for different ranges, and the different types of systems are good at intercepting different types of targets. So Iron Dome emerged from a need that Israel was being fired upon with small, relatively amateurish, if I may say, rockets from the Gaza Strip, for example. And so the system was designed for intercepting that type of projectile. And so you have certain air defense systems that are short range and that are good at intercepting shells and rockets. And then you have other types of systems that are longer range and that can also engage aircraft. And then you have the very long range, even exoatmospheric systems, in order to try to intercept ICBMs. So
intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Yes.
Peter, let me come to you because Iron Dome and this are not the same, but they may have similarities. Care to comment on that? An Iron Dome was designed specifically to protect population centres. Is that what this is going to be about in Europe? Because presumably there are whole areas that need protecting, not just those that are densely populated.
Right, and if you buy one Iron Dome system, do you choose to protect Paris or do you choose to protect Toulon, Berlin or Frankfurt? You know, these are decisions that people would have to make. So you're looking, I think, at something wider. This arrangement is talking about three systems in particular: the Patriot, which is a US system, a sort of medium-range system; the RST, which is a German system at much shorter range; and then Arrow 3, which is the Israeli system, which is much longer range. So that sort of idea would cover a whole range of threats. But the scale of their ambition is really significant. I mean, we're talking about not just the firing chains involved, but we're talking about the amount of satellite connectivity you've got to have to be able to monitor and prove that something took off. Then the interceptors to match that missile as it's coming towards you. But really, we're talking about the command and control here, because the speed we're talking about having to make decisions is really significant. So, for example, hypersonic missiles, which are now in use in most every place. China has them. Iran's been developing them. We're seeing them used increasingly around the world, and to think of their proliferation in 5 years is significant, right? So if one was launched in Kaliningrad, it would take about 14 minutes to hit Paris. It would take 5 minutes maybe to hit Berlin, maybe about, 2 minutes to hit Warsaw. I mean, Madrid's lucky. It's got like 20 minutes warning time. But genuinely, we're talking about something that needs to be able to make a decision from detection through to putting something in a firing chain and getting it out there to hit something before it hits you inside, say, 10 minutes. Now, whether, who has control of that? Who holds the firing key? Is it centralized in Europe? Is it part of NATO? Is it elsewhere? Is this sovereignty, is it owned nationally? None of these things have been decided. Now, NATO had a system for this and was developing the NATO ballistic missile defense shield. This is something that seems to be altogether separate. And what we don't understand is really the details.
OK, Elisabeth, let me come to you. The United States may well be part of this. Who decides?
Who decides where to put the focus? Well, that is a question. But if I may add a different point, David, so the challenge, I think, in communicating these sort of efforts is, it's fantastic that it's happening, but I think gives people the idea that they can sleep safely under this Iron Dome in a European version of it, and nothing will happen to them, and that is a false sense of security, and I think Western governments now have to be a bit more honest and transparent with the public in their countries and say we are not going to be able to protect you in every way against every threat, and life may look rather different. That is clearly what's happened to Ukrainians.
Well, can I put it this way? If you're suggesting it is merely a fig leaf, the fig leaf doesn't even do the basic job it's supposed to if people can see behind it or through it.
Well, it's not a fig leaf. It's a bit stronger than a fig leaf, but it's not the proverbial roof that can keep you safe against anything that happens outside the structure you're in. And so if we call it sort of the European version of the Iron Dome, then people are going to think, well, actually, then I don't feel so bad about what may happen. Well, they shouldn't feel bad about what will happen. They should feel like they have a stake in helping their countries protect themselves against whatever may happen. And that includes much more than this missile shield. It includes, for example, something that has become even more urgent in recent weeks, which is keeping an eye out on for any sort of suspicious movements near sensitive infrastructure. Everybody's talking about how governments can defend or can keep an eye on sensitive infrastructure. That's a role for the public too. And all of that, all of those efforts combined can help make countries safe, not just the Iron Dome whenever it materializes.
Well, look, here, if I may, Edward, before I come to ask you a question, we're going to hear from Olaf Scholz, German Chancellor.
Ein früherer deutscher Verteidigungsminister.
Former German defence minister thought we were only surrounded by friends. The truth is that politics, business and large sections of society were only too happy to believe this thesis and drew far-reaching conclusions from it. Incorrect conclusions, as we know today, especially when we look at the state of the Bundeswehr.
And basically he's saying times have changed. So my question to you, Edward, is going back to something Peter mentioned, the system that NATO was working on. How much more advanced does it have to be these days to be effective?
I think there's several aspects. It's not just a question of being more advanced. I think, as we were discussing before, there's a variety of threats, and that's the complexity. So first of all, for countries that are very close to Russia, you could even imagine long-range artillery strikes or kind of kamikaze drones. So similar things to what Ukraine is experiencing now. In addition, the whole suite of ballistic missiles that have existed for decades. And in addition, also cruise missiles, which have more complicated trajectories to intercept. So we have to be able to defend against all of those, and that's the complexity. And there's multiple challenges. One is in terms of being advanced, so that, for example, trying to intercept intercontinental ballistic missiles, that is something that is evolving. It's technically very difficult to do. Intercepting certain types of cruise missiles is also incredibly difficult. And then there's the capacity problem, as Peter was mentioning before, the number of systems you have to have, the inventories that you have to have, also if you face a prolonged campaign like what Ukraine is facing now. So indeed, the expenditure has to be absolutely enormous, and we're far below in Europe in terms of both the systems and the capacities.
In terms of what's been tried in the past, I was reporting in the early 80s on Ronald Reagan and what was known as Star Wars, the Strategic Defense Initiative. That must almost seem, and it never happened, by the way, that must almost seem like a toy compared with the problems that you can foresee with this one, the problems and the intricacies.
Well, the technologies have advanced. And if you look at systems like Arrow 3, if you look at the progress that the United States has made with elements of ballistic missile defense, we are certainly in a much more advanced place than in the 1980s, when there was perhaps even an element of bluff on the part of the US government towards the USSR.
Elisabeth, you're nodding your head in agreement to something that we've heard from Edward. I was going to ask you about SDI, Star Wars. Anyway, please continue.
I was just going to say that it was a brilliant communications game by Ronald Reagan, was it not? This idea that the US would spend and obviously outspend the Soviets. And that came at the time when the Soviets were struggling mightily with their economy. So it was clear that they would not be able to keep up. So even though, as you say, it didn't come to pass, everybody got the idea that, oh, the US is winning. It was really a brilliant communications strategy by Reagan and his advisors.
If in the 1980s what we saw was a threat from the United States that never materialized, but that was enough to hasten the economic collapse of the Soviet Union that tried to keep up in an arms race, are we seeing something similar here, where the threat of this missile defense shield could be enough to make the Russians think again about aggression in the future?
I certainly think so. So they are struggling mightily financially. They have lost lots of Western companies, companies having left as a result of sanctions, and also as a result of public pressure. They have lost their most of their access to international finance. They've lost access to international insurance. And on top of that, the mobilization has been conducted in such a haphazard manner that they don't have people in key positions, whether it be welder or manager of emergency services. They don't have those positions, the people in those positions anymore, because they've been mobilized in this very chaotic manner. So the Russian economy is struggling already, and we'll see the results in terms of financial output in the very near future. How could Russia possibly keep up with a shield like this, or with a military effort like this, military industrial effort like this? And on top of that, we should remember that lots of Russian technology experts have already left the country because they saw the writing on the wall even before the mobilization. So who are the people who, even if there were to be money, who would be the people with the expertise required to build this, to build a corresponding
So this could be, in a sense, history repeating itself. So same sort of question to you, Peter, unless you want to answer something else. Is this more about political posturing than military might?
I don't think it is. I mean, to my mind, I think there is a lot of supplanting on decision makers who are our adversaries, our own set of rationality and logics. And I don't think we have the same understanding of them. Certainly our leaders don't have the understanding of them that they did back in the Cold War about the Soviet Union. So I don't buy into this argument that it is necessarily there to just put off Vladimir Putin and potential adversaries. I think that what people are starting to understand is we don't understand our adversaries. They don't act in a way that we understand. They don't take the signals that we're sending and react to them. That this is a dynamic. And I think Russia is going to retain, for the foreseeable future, a considerable weapon stock of missiles and airborne weapons that could shine down on European cities relatively easily.
I'm sorry to hasten you on this, but we're running out of time. Do you think Israel's going to cooperate on this because it already has some of the technology, or will it want to keep it to itself? And could you employ some kind of Iron Dome on a junior level, if you like, pro tem, while this major system's being developed?
So let's deal with Iron Dome first. Iron Dome could protect some towns, some cities, depending on how many you buy. It's not going to protect the entire region. And it's going to rely on states to buy them, and then on Israel to build enough of them quickly enough that we can protect those cities. Okay. I don't see that happening for a lot of cities anytime soon.
Edward, I see a situation, sorry to cut you short, but time's our enemy. I see a situation developing here where one country might say, actually, we need this more than the country next door needs it, than the country next door to that needs it. Says, well, actually, we need it more than you need it. Is it going to be a case of every country having to put their own arguments forward, dog eat dog, and that Finland may well lose out, Finland may win, but at the expense of others?
Well, hopefully that won't be too much the case, and I think that's precisely why the German initiative is welcome. I mean, they're basically federating 15 European allies in total, including Germany, to try to coordinate exactly for that reason, to try to coordinate which systems to buy, some sort of coordinated procurement to avoid both price gouging on the part of manufacturers who may be rubbing their hands because they're going to argue they don't have enough capacity to produce, which is of course partly true, but it also opens the door to excessive prices. And so hopefully this can be counterbalanced if these 15 European countries coordinate their purchases and work together in order to coordinate their orders.
I wonder if you're not one of the 15 countries, but you happen to think you still need defending, where that leaves you down the pecking order.
Well, obviously it's not a binding mechanism where all of a sudden all of the 15 defense ministries are forced to follow a single script. But nevertheless, there has to be some sort of spirit of collaboration, and that's the aim of the initiative. So I'd like to be at least a little bit optimistic. And I would also say that in terms of purchases, although we've discussed during this program that it will take many years to be fully protected, more is more. And so hopefully even in a couple of years' time, there'll already be some more protection. And my last point, if I may, it's also about deterrence. So protecting our cities and regions and critical infrastructure is one thing, but the Russian Federation shouldn't forget that we can also strike back if they strike us.
Elisabeth, last one for you, if I may. Sorry to ask you to keep it brief, but if there is infighting, if nobody gets around the table and sorts this out in a calm manner, it could be dog eat dog, and the person who's throwing stones at the candle, in other words, the enemy, comes out the winner.
I think NATO countries are experienced enough with Russia as a country that constantly undermines unity, that they will figure out their differences before they see the light of the day in the press. So I wouldn't be too concerned about that. But it is, as you say, a potential conflict among those countries, and indeed any countries that may want to be part of it. But in the meantime, it's great that it's happening and that Germany is taking the initiative. So let's hope we see more of that.
Thank you very much indeed. We fitted into half an hour what may well take years and years to complete. Thank you for coming on the programme. Thank you, wherever you're watching this edition of Roundtable, for sparing us the time. We hope you'll do the same on another occasion.